of our people. So welcome, James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak and meet with you all. I'm going to take about maybe 20-25 minutes of your time to go through, in about 3 different parts, a bit about what I do and my interest in the history of this area. I should start, and I will start by saying that I'm no particular expert in the recent history of the Mississauga. My interests extend into what we refer to, I think it's quite a nice term, into deep time. So into the very, very ancient past, thousands of years ago, and trying to understand the history and the ways that people lived their lives in these landscapes in periods where we only get small glimpses through the material records. It's a challenging discipline, but it's incredibly rewarding where we can make sense of patterns in the past. So the 3 parts that I'm going to discuss are very briefly sort of the history of the archaeology of this area in terms of when people were first, or when we first identified people in this area, what they were doing, and how they relate to other people in the Americas. I'm then going to show a few slides that just explain how archaeology works, what we do as archaeologists. And then at the end, very quickly, just go through some of the ethical and moral concerns and issues that I and some of you might share in terms of disturbance of sites, and particularly in burials, and what happens when burials get disturbed, and what the end process should be, but unfortunately often isn't. Okay, so the story begins in this area as much as it does across most of the Canadian part of North America, about 10 to 11,000 years ago. Now, archaeologists recognize, and the tradition now is to, in much of this period of archaeology, recognize, in fact, people have been in this landscape for longer than that. But unfortunately in Canada, and in this particular part of the province in particular, we were under a couple kilometers of ice, which had the effect of principally eradicating most traces of people in this landscape before about 11,000 years ago. After about 11,000 years ago, when the ice receded, it opened up the landscape and it was quickly colonized by what archaeologists refer to as the Paleo-Indians, at about 11,000 years ago. They were principally, as it seems, after caribou in these periglacial landscapes. So if you can picture at a moment what this area would be like with the beautiful rolling hills which were left by the glaciers, it would be populated, it would look like the Northwest Territories with a spruce parkland environment, caribou wandering over the landscape, large herds of caribou wandering over the landscape, Arctic fish in some of the lakes and rivers, and people, small bands of people, tracking over the landscape after caribou. This is a particularly you might not realize, but a particularly well-represented period in this area, principally through Laurie Jackson's work, who some of you may know, who lives just on the south side of Rice Lake, who did an awful lot of survey in the Plainville area and identified several very, very early Paleo-Indian sites. So the history, in terms of sort of the more recent history of people in this area, begins about 11,000 years ago, and is part of a much bigger story about how these peoples in the Americas were inhabiting these very harsh glacial landscapes. So they were after caribou, like that, and there are many sites throughout the Americas and Canada that show that caribou is probably one of the things that they're primarily concerned with. And they were making very, very beautiful spearheads, and that's what we principally are looking for and finding archaeologically. These are called fluted points. They're some of the most sophisticated types of armaments that people ever made in the world. They're incredibly beautiful and very, very technically complex to make. The story begins in this area about 11,000 years ago, as I said, and progresses through a series of different phases. The BP stands for years before present, so about 11,000 years before present. We then sort of chop up in slices the different time periods and try to make sense of what people were doing in these different time periods. The past, as we know today, was pretty dynamic in terms of how it changed, and we have a various representation of species at these sites that allow us to understand and build pictures about how people were hunting and what they were subsisting on, and how they were organizing their lives around the resources available to them. My particular interest as an archaeologist is in animals. I study animals in the past. I study how people used them, how they treated them, how they thought about them, and also how they responded to changes when animals were available and less available. So for instance, one period I'm really interested in is about 4,200 years ago when there was a drought in this area. We know that from environmental reconstructions, including cores that were taken not far from here on Rice Lake. And they can show that there are quite significant changes in the environment about 4,200 years ago linked to a severe drought that affected large parts of eastern North America. That would cause, for instance, a shift in the ranges and abundance of certain species, and how people adapted to that is particularly interesting. So one of the things we look at, for instance, is the emergence of particular types of sites around this time. One of them is the McIntyre site, which is on the north shore of Rice Lake, where certainly people have been, as I said before, living in this area for a long period of time, but it's sometimes difficult to see what they're doing because they're moving around so quickly, leaving such ephemeral traces. They tread very lightly in these landscapes. But around this time, we start to find very, very large sites, McIntyre being one of them, adjacent to the wetlands. This had some very, very deep storage pits associated with it. This was excavated in the 1970s. And those deep storage pits are probably used for storage of food. And what we think is happening, because of the drought, people are moving more closely and using these wetland areas more extensively than they had before. So for McIntyre, what we can do is begin to track the foods that people were using and make lists of different types of species that were present in these environments and what people were doing and how they were harvesting and using and processing and making decisions about what animals and what plants to use. So we have all these species are represented at the McIntyre site between about 42 and 3,700 years ago. So we can on the basis of their abundance, we can make predictions about how these animals existed in this landscape. So there, of course, things will be things that are very familiar to a lot of you: deer, bear, beaver, wolf, muskrat, lynx, cottontail rabbit, dog, raccoon. They're all present there in different numbers. Also reptiles and birds. Bird bones don't preserve particularly well, which is why there are few of them. And fish, of course, as well. And then, of course, we do the same thing with plants. We have a list of different plants that were present at the site. So from this, we can build a very, very good picture about how people organized their food and their lifeways and why they were living in these particular areas at some points at very critical times in the environment. Now, the other most visible phase of use of this area after that period where there's a drought and you get the emergence of these very large wetland sites is in a period that we refer to as the Middle Woodland. There are some examples of Middle Woodland artifacts in the cabinets over there. The largest site in the area, in fact it's one of the largest in the province of this period, is of course the Serpent Mounds. But this is just one of a large number of burial mound sites that exist in these landscapes. In fact, the landscape that we inhabit has over 900, it's almost about 950 registered archaeological sites, about 100 of which have evidence of having had some form of human remains or existing human remains in them. So it's important to sort of recognize that those Serpent Mounds is a very prominent site, that there are many, many other places, perhaps not quite as large as Serpent Mounds, but a very large number of sites that relate to this particular period. Now the interesting thing about Serpent Mounds and these other sites where you get these large mounds being constructed is, again, they're on the waterways, but they're part of a much larger phenomena of increased investment in ritual and burial across the whole eastern part of North America, which is referred to as the Hopewell Period. So these sorts of things aren't just happening in Ontario, but they're happening in Ohio and Pennsylvania, all the way down into the northern parts of Florida. So what that tells us is that people were certainly interacting within this area across a very, very large geographic area and sharing ideas and approaches and understanding about appropriate ways to not just live their lives, but also appropriate ways to conduct ceremony and especially treat the dead. Now, within the immediate Rice Lake area, some of you might have seen Ann Taylor from Curve Lake, her article in the Examiner from a few days ago that referred to the importance of leaving burial places in the areas that they're found. And in the context of that article, she referred to the fact that ancestors buried people on the pathways and roadways throughout the river networks that people traversed in the past. So they could be visited in the normal daily course of moving through these landscapes. One of the things that I'm interested in doing is understanding how this entire area works as how people use the lakes and rivers to move around, how they were the highways of the past. And so I've done some studies about the frequency with which people likely move through areas and tried to work out how that relates to the positioning of archaeological sites. But one of the things that I did was just plot out some of the important places where we know that there are burial mounds within the Rice Lake area. So these little dots, they are numbered, but you probably can't see them from where you are. Just mark out important burial places where people have constructed mounds in the Rice Lake area. So this has the highest number, the highest density of burial mounds of these incredibly important ritual places in the province. And so Rice Lake, from where we're standing now all the way through to the sort of upper reaches of the Otonabee River, is recognized as being a particularly active area 2,000 years ago for people who were participating in this much larger sphere of interaction of, as I said earlier, shared approaches to ceremony, ritual, and especially how to treat and think about the dead. So this area, in terms of a shared history, fits and actually contributes a very, very large piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding a really dynamic period of the past that is approachable partially through oral traditions, but also through archaeology, which gives us some material evidence of how people were inhabiting this landscape. There we go. There's the number of registered archaeological sites in the Trent Severn watershed as of 2 years ago. So there are more now. Each red dot is a provincially registered site and protected under Ontario law for being registered. The best way to protect archaeological sites is through registering them with the province, because the fines for disturbing a registered site are very, very high, and the penalty is quite severe. Protects it both from development and also just people going out and digging in it, because it's illegal to dig in a registered archaeological site as well. So it stops it also from potentially being looted by people who are after trying to find antiquities or pots or arrowheads. So the more sites that we can register, and the more people that are qualified to register sites, the better. Unfortunately, of course, not all sites are registered. And I'll just give you a few slides on some work that I was involved in for several years up at Gannon's Narrows on Pigeon Lake, working with Curve Lake to help document and preserve and protect, unfortunately it's now protected in situ, a very large set of burials that are about 4,000 years old. It's the oldest cemetery in the province. So it once again speaks to the importance of the ancient people in this area and how active they were in commemorating and protecting and preserving and remembering their dead through acts of burial. It's up in that area there. So this is actually not on the burial area, I'm not showing any of our work on the burial, but this is trying to make sense of some of the environmental history of that part of the island. The burial area is sort of more or less where I'm standing, so about 40 meters away from it. But the process of archaeology is actually a bit like watching paint dry. It's a very slow and actually quite tedious process, and a lot of people who experience it are disappointed within about the first 5 minutes, because you pretty much learn all you need to know in terms of how to do field archaeology within about the first couple of hours of doing it, and then it doesn't really change much after that. So you have to have patience more than anything else. But it's essentially a process of removing soil and documenting what you find in the soil in a very, very thorough and precise and laborious way. So those of you who know the Gannon's Narrows area or boated around Pigeon Lake, it's within Curve Lake's traditional territory, and certainly people have known about the island. The name, of course, Jacob, is well known in the Curve Lake area. We were principally working in this area of the island. Now the island didn't look like, in fact wasn't an island in the time that people were there, because the raising of the water levels have inundated it. It was connected through Fulton's Bog and White Island, which is at the top of the slide. But this little part here, where a lot of the activity lies, is looking over an incredibly rich wetland 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago that would have been full of all the sorts of things that you could imagine, including likely large stands of rice, and all the muskrat, beaver, etc., turtles. So it's a very, very productive and important part of the landscape, and it's also on a major travel route between the upland shield areas and the lower, more fertile areas to the south. So it's not surprising that people invested in this part of the landscape very, very heavily and chose to recognize the importance of the place by burying their ancestors there. So the process of actually investigating sites like this, and incidentally we found more and later periods, including sort of a 1,500 to 1,000-year-old village in another part of the island as well. It's just a very, very busy place in the past. The process of doing excavation is very, very time-consuming, but we excavate large areas to try to understand and see traces of how people use that landscape that are now covered by, of course, the topsoil. So what some of my students and assistants are doing here is we're documenting big storage pits that were likely used to store probably nuts and rice and things like that. They're very deep. They often go to at least a meter or sometimes even more in depth and would have been lined and stored with all sorts of goods that people could come back and retrieve when they needed them. So what they look like when we excavate, that's what we're looking for. Stones have been moved out the way. There's a dark stain which is hard to see with the lighting there, but that is the treasure trove. That's the gold mine of what we're actually after. It's not very exciting unless you're an archaeologist, but that when we found it was caused for an awful lot of excitement because when we excavate it, it's full of charred remains. It's full of all the debris that people would have produced several thousand years ago that allow us to reconstruct very precisely what people were doing and what sort of environments they were living in. So the sorts of things that we often recover are rocks and stone of different types. And we know where those rocks and stone come from because we have the geological sourcing of them, so we can track the connections between people and where they traded or accessed or acquired these different materials. We find lots and lots of animal bone, and from that we can reconstruct the sorts of animals. We know and identify the sorts of animals. I brought with me, again in one of my boxes, a skeleton of a loon, just as an example, because we find bones and then we use comparative anatomy to document what those animals were. We use flotation devices such as this. My friends Kate and Sue are working on this, where we process the soil from these features to recover things that are incredibly uninteresting to look at, but are the charred seeds, that the plants that people were using. And from that, we're able to reconstruct information about when things would have been available, what things people were doing, and when they lived in these landscapes. So although the data that we use to do this isn't visually that exciting, the information is incredibly rich and allows us to build quite sophisticated understanding of the lifeways of these people. So you of course all are aware of the ways in which the landscape have changed. So this is really important to us as well. So we use bathymetry data to reconstruct what the ancient landscapes would have looked like. That's, again, Jacob Island up in Pigeon Lake, but work has also been done for all the Rice Lake area on reconstructing the ancient landscapes. So we can tell very precisely how much territory has been lost and what the impact on resource distribution would be from the flooding of the landscapes with the Trans-Severn waterway. And we can, with a pretty narrow range of error, say how many hectares of land have been lost and what the impact on the loss of particular species would be. So this is an area in paleo-environmental reconstruction that I'm particularly interested in. And I've got some funding applications in with the government now to extend some of this work to try to build a bigger picture of ancient habitats and loss of those habitats through more recent flooding events. So very quickly now, just at the end, I'll touch on some of the law and ethics with regards to this. Unfortunately, archaeologists are often no different than the public, and usually the first time we hear about something is after the press have already got a hold of it. And this is often sometimes the first that we realize that an archaeological site has been disturbed. Usually this happens, and it's happened recently up in the Hastings area, and it happened a few months ago on Spook Island, and it's happened upon in the Quarkas as well. It happens all the time. If an archaeological site is disturbed, the people doing the disturbance don't necessarily recognize it for an archaeological site, so we miss it. Usually, when sites are disturbed, and if they contain human remains, hopefully people recognize the fact that these are bones, and they will call in somebody. Unfortunately, the press often get a hold of it beforehand and tend to sensationalize it when it doesn't really need sensationalizing. But usually the process is that the OPP are called in, the coroner makes an assessment, and then it's determined that it's non-forensic, it's not a murder victim, and that it's archaeological. And then the chain usually starts with what's called the Registrar of Cemeteries in Toronto, who then contacts a local archaeologist, sometimes me, sometimes Laurie Jackson, and we then begin to make, and often the local First Nation as well, and we begin to discuss how best to manage this. So I don't want to go into an awful lot of the legal procedural details involved in this. The end process that everybody is trying to achieve is something like this. Not that this is necessarily what everybody necessarily wants, or it's the best case, but it's leaving those human remains in situ with as least disturbance as possible, but documenting them sufficiently such that the province can designate it as an Aboriginal people's burial place, assign an identity to it as best they can, and in perpetuity protect that place as a registered cemetery. This is from the Brock Street burials, opposite what then used to be Price Chopper in Peterborough on Brock Street. That's now Fresh Cove. And where Curve Lake were involved after the city had negligently disturbed the burial when they were resurfacing that parking lot, despite having full awareness that there would be a burial there. They just they just made a mistake and disturbed human remains, and that it was quite a long process to get to this stage, but those human remains were reinterred and are now nicely marked, and it's to everybody, more or less everybody's satisfaction. That's the ideal. It would have been better not to disturb them in the first place. What happens is that archaeologists have the responsibility on behalf of the Ministry of dealing with archaeological sites, but also, and this is a cause of some contention, the Ministry have downgraded the responsibility of negotiating with Aboriginal communities down to archaeologists as well. A lot of archaeologists feel that this should be the responsibility of the Crown. It's not necessarily our responsibility to negotiate on their behalf, but nevertheless they've now they've devolved that process down to people like me and Laurie Jackson and other local archaeologists. So under policy, statutory policy, it's our responsibility when archaeological sites are found to negotiate with the designated First Nation in the area to say we found an archaeological site. It might contain humans, it might not contain human remains. But this is what we're intending to do with it. What do you think? And receive feedback on that process. As I pointed out on the earlier slide, there are hundreds of archaeological sites in this area that track the history of these peoples and the Mississauga back thousands of years. So these are not odd occurrences. This happens all the time. And the one most recently that I dealt with was 2 weeks ago, doing an assessment on Spook Island on behalf of with Hiawatha's the acknowledgement and support of Hiawatha because of the exposure and erosion of a burial. In this particular case, caused by the ice buildup that knocked away some sand, and a skeleton rolled out that some boys found in the spring, and the OPP came out. And we did an assessment to establish, is this part of a larger burial ground, or is it just a single person? It turned out it's just a single person. But that doesn't take very long to deal with. Hiawatha and the landowner are now negotiating what to do with it. But this happens probably more frequently than you realize. There are a number of laws that deal with archaeology that include the Funeral Burial Cremation Services Act, the Heritage Act, Planning Act, etc. These all govern how we do archaeology. A message that I can put out to people who live in these areas, if these things are happening, such as somebody on a farm you've noticed is putting in a solar panel system, or something is happening where there's grading, and you have oral traditions or knowledge that could impact on some of your ancient places, important places, and even potentially archaeological sites that aren't registered, you really should, if you're concerned about that, let someone know. A good person to let know would be either through Laurie Jackson or through myself. I can certainly leave my contact details, but people know how to get a hold of me. I'm at Trent University, and it's very easy just to Google my name. Because we can issue very quickly, if we suspect that a site is being damaged, issue moratoriums on construction very, very rapidly to ensure that heritage protection there's been due diligence in terms of heritage protection. Unfortunately, as I said, we often hear about this after the fact. And by then, a lot of the damage has been done, and we've lost a lot of information that otherwise would be useful. And in many cases, we've lost the ability to protect the site because it's already been damaged. Depending on what the site is, we can often just stop construction, and it's done. It's now protected. You now cannot disturb that area. So archaeology can be a very, very valuable tool in terms of land conservation and historical preservation of landscapes. Unfortunately, we can't stop development that goes through the correct channels. If a developer wants to build a 10-acre solar farm and goes through the right process, it's sometimes archaeology is not the tool to do that with. Usually these developers are very, very Samsung, they understand the law and they work well within it. But archaeology can be a useful tool to help protect landscapes in certain circumstances. So we usually conduct archaeological assessments. These are details which aren't necessarily important. But what we also do is work with municipalities to identify landscapes at risk, telling them where you have to be careful if any construction takes place. I live in Peterborough. I work with the municipality of Peterborough to develop a prediction map or a heritage preservation map that essentially says any construction in any of this red zone, basically if you're around the waterways or some of the elevated drumlins up in these areas there, require heritage assessments in order to ensure that you're not going to damage a site if you do any construction. Fortunately, through the Heritage Office in the City of Peterborough, Eric Hansen in particular, they've been very, very good at ensuring that sites don't get damaged. Trent Hills is not so good. Trent Lakes is not so good. So some of the municipalities have a lot to learn in terms of ensuring they're doing their duty under the Planning Act to make sure that archaeological sites and the heritage of the Mississauga in particular aren't being destroyed through wholly preventable means by simply having archaeological assessments done. So that's what we're trying to do, is work sort of in a conservation sense to protect, preserve, and document sites. So and end up ideally not even with this, ideally not even at this end process where we have to go through recovery, damage control, and then a long process of negotiation about reburial. The ideal circumstances we identified beforehand. We work with the landowner. We say this is worth preserving in situ, and we leave it essentially as it was found. So, I've lost. There it is. That's it. So if anybody has any questions about the work I do or particular types of archaeology that we've encountered in this area or how or sites that you know about and want information on or any questions about what I do, by all means, I'm hanging around for a while. You can come and talk to me. I have some boxes of artifacts at the back to show you some of the material that we've got that I can show as well. So I'm just going to treat it really informally, and as lunch perhaps unfolds, just by all means come up and chat, and I'm happy to talk to anybody. Thank you.